Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the James Kennedy Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation I had last week with the awesome Dr. Dean Burnett, talking all about the brain and neuroscience, neuroplasticity, mental health, emotions, evolution, all that clever stuff. And for those of you that listen to the podcast on YouTube, you may have noticed something different happening on the YouTube channel this past week. Because I've been uploading the videos from the conversations I had on the street live outside the Royal Courts of Justice 2 weeks ago in London for the Julian Assange hearing. Interviews with Jeremy Corbyn, Richard Medhurst, Andrew Feinstein, Chloe Schlossberg, Len McCluskey, Daniel Lismore, and today's guest, but more on that in just a bit. So if you don't listen to the podcast on YouTube, which is 99% of my listenership, mostly listens to it on Spotify and Apple, and thank you very much for doing so, then you're not going to get to hear those interviews unless you go to YouTube. So go to James Kennedy Podcast on YouTube, and you can see those interviews live on the street in the moment amongst the chaos and enjoy some exclusive content. Since we last spoke, I've mostly just been doing band stuff, man. I've been focusing on the mighty James Kennedy and the Underdogs. I did a Palestinian fundraiser gig on the weekend, and then we did a full band gig on the Sunday in Swansea, which was awesome. If you want to know where we're playing, or if you want us to come to your town, head to jameskennedystuff.com/tribe. Go to the tribe page and just whack in your email address and your city into the box, and then we'll let you know when we're coming near you. Now, before we dive into today's conversation, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to the podcast. It doesn't cost anything, it only takes a few seconds, and it really helps us out. So if you could click subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, give us a like, give us a comment, or a thumbs up, or a share would be amazing. Or just tell your friends. Word of mouth is really powerful. It all really, really helps. I think these conversations are important and certainly interesting. And as the old saying goes, knowledge is power. So I'm going to keep these brilliant conversations with awesome guests coming. And if you could keep clicking, it'll help the whole thing to stay afloat. But now let's get on with it. As I said, I interviewed today's guest already 2 weeks ago in London. That interview will be dropping on my YouTube channel any day now. But today we're going to be focusing on a completely different subject than the one we talked about in London. We'll be focusing on today's guest's speciality, something they have spent years and years of their life researching, written several books on, and made several documentaries about. Basically, they know what they're talking about. And we're going to be doing a deep dive into all of it with them today, because I think this is super important and dead interesting. So please join me in welcoming onto the show Dr. Matthew Alford. He is a lecturer at the University of Bath, an author, a filmmaker, and a leading authority on the collusion between the CIA and Hollywood, which is what we're going to be talking all about today. Matt, thank you so much for doing this, man. I can't wait to jump into this. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me, James.
Oh man, it's a pleasure. I can't wait to jump into this because you were involved in a line of research that is super, super fascinating. And it's something that I know loads of people listening to this are not going to know anything about, and their mind is going to be blown wide open to hear about all the stuff that is going on that you've been uncovering and proving and documenting for quite a while now. So to throw us into this, what would you say is the main premise of the work that you've been doing for many years now?
The premise is, it kind of came from that exact sentiment that you just expressed, which is, not having a clue that this kind of thing is happening. When we first started looking into this, sort of 15 or so years ago, it looked like a complete conspiracy theory. The idea that the government, the US government, was rewriting Hollywood film scripts and TV shows was just a really peculiar idea. I remember a song by the band James. I don't know if you remember the band James, and they did a really good song in about, must have been the late 90s, called something like "My TV's staring at me saying all our money goes into the military." I always remember thinking, that was a curious little lyric to use. But it always seemed like quite a kind of mysterious, sort of abstract, sort of almost like a sort of poetic thing to say based on nothing.
Right.
But what we found, particularly circa 2015, was this huge tranche of documents from the Department of Defense showing that they rewrite several thousand movies and TV shows.
Wow.
And that was the first major sort of chunk taken out of this wall of secrecy as we saw it. And so, that's what we've been doing. I mean, we were dabbling in this work at the beginning of the 20th century when there was almost a complete blanket of secrecy around it. But really, the big sort of avalanche of material came around about 2015, and then led to this. We started off in 2015 with about 3,000 pages of documents, and then and that's when we realised, that the government has affected maybe 10,000 plus products. But now we're up to about 60,000 pages of documentation with a lot more details filled in about the extent to which these changes are political. So basically, the government does control a lot of TV. And it's not just the government, it's the militarized, securitized aspects of the government, the CIA and Department of Defense.
Jesus Christ, that is mental, man. 60,000 pages of documents supporting this. I kind of had a feeling, really, like on some films when you see them and they're so overly sickly patriotic, where the lone bedraggled hero, claws his way to the top of the mountain to place down the US flag and all is good in the world. You kind of think, oh, Jesus Christ. But you could never tell if that's just the kind of cultural indoctrination of the filmmaker, that was their actual vision, or whether it's a result of direct editorial influence on behalf of the government. Is that a factor, or is it always the latter?
Both of those things you say are completely accurate. And I mean, it really is the case that there are a lot of movies that are extremely nationalistic and militaristic without any involvement by the Department of Defense.
Right.
So I'd say all of these things are going on. So I'm trying to think of the best examples. Take a very, very violent xenophobic movie, really, like American Sniper. I don't know if you saw that Clint Eastwood film from 2013, which was glorifying someone who could well have been a psychopath, who went around murdering people in Iraq as a sniper. Now, that film was so extreme in what it was advocating, basically taking out civilians in Iraq, protecting, as the main character is seeing it, protecting the herd of sheep from the wolves, but very sort of self-congratulatory. That film was so violent and so pro-military that the Department of Defense didn't want anything to do with it.
Right.
They knew it would be a bad PR look for them.
Right.
It would just be insane. Or even go back a little bit with a film like one of George Clooney's first film that he did when he came off TV in 1997 was called The Peacemaker. Now, that film did not have Department of Defense support. That film was about, with Nicole Kidman, was basically justifying the idea of it was basically like Team America, World Police, but without the jokes.
Right. Right.
It was them going around into Russian airspace, just bombing everything that they could. All of the Muslims are baddies and have all got nuclear weapons. Do you know what I mean? And of course, the Peacemaker was basically, that's the United States. That's the securitized United States.
Right.
So there are a lot of films. I mean, my research gives the impression that everything is about this one office. Or the set of offices in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., which are kind of controlling and manipulating events. But it is more complicated than that. And in fact, this is our book from 2017. The final chapter of this book, which is perhaps the least read chapter of the book, does point out the extent to which this is a cultural problem and not just a government problem. Right. But that's not to understate the problem, the level of the institutional problem here as well. The fact is, if you've got 10,000 plus products that are being directly affected at script level by the government, you do have a problem. It's not just cultural, it's both.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, so I suppose there are some films then where the Department of Defense would look at it and be like, well, no further work needed. That's fine. Put it out.
Yeah, either no work needed because it's kind of fine, but then they usually offer some kind of courtesy support anyway, because there's usually something they can do to help. Or that they say, look, this is just too rich for our blood. This is, this politically is just awkward, even though it's kind of promoting America. It's making us look as insane as we are. So that kind of thing does happen. There's all sorts of different permutations.
So how does this play out then in the day-by-day nature of the thing? I mean, let's take a hypothetical just to illustrate the point. So you've got a script that's been written by somebody independently of the government. It's just their passion project. They've written it. They've got a producer. There's a whole team together. They're making the film. The government has no involvement in it whatsoever. They're just doing their thing and making a movie. At what point does the government get involved? How do they get involved? And what is the nature of their involvement?
It does vary a bit, but the standard process would be that the producers themselves would approach the Department of Defense and ask for some support, whether they ask for some helicopters or they ask for some extras or an aircraft carrier or whatever it is, or just advice and generic support. Almost always it does come from the producers themselves. This isn't really, although it does, and it can't be for reasons of democracy. It can't be the government going around tapping on a filmmaker's shoulders and saying, "Hey, you, we want to control your film."
Right.
There's not a great deal of that. But that said, the relationships between them are so close that it might as well be that in a lot of instances. But obviously, in a democracy, you can't really have that kind of heavy-handed approach. So it is voluntary. In theory, it is voluntary from the producers. They will approach the Department of Defense, just send in a form. And me and the executive producer, Roger Stahl, have both written in forms at one time or another to ask for Department of Defense support on our bogus projects to see what they say. And in our film, Theatres of War, Roger, his application, he records on tape, and you see that they get very uncomfortable because he says, "Will you support my documentary about your processes?"
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was quite a funny bit of our documentary. And so the producer will approach them, and then they will get back to them, and they will say, "Give us your whole script." They'll read the whole context of that script to make sure that there's nothing in it that bothers them. If there is, they'll send back an extensive list of changes required.
Wow. And that's very much conditional then. So if you want to use our airplanes or our airstrip or whatever, this has to change or go fuck yourself, is it?
Yeah, it's completely conditional. And I would describe the Department of Defense and the CIA, but particularly the Department of Defense, as being a very heavy-handed executive producer.
Right.
That's basically what they're doing. They will brook no compromise about the content of the film. Even one line would be enough to get to be what they call a showstopper. So anything that indicates that there is or was racism in the ranks, or high levels of assault amongst the troops.
Right.
Anything that indicates that nuclear weapons aren't under control or aren't safe in any way. Anything that indicates war crimes, anything that indicates that the US is involved in assassinations, anything that indicates that that troops might frag their officers, that means murder their officers, anything that just anything involving drug taking,
right.
Anything that involves. I mean, there's all sorts of. It's as wide as you could possibly imagine. Anything that will bring the not just the military into disrepute or the CIA into disrepute, but anything that will bring the American government policy into disrepute.
Right.
Now, obviously, that's one of those aspects of the of this arrangement that they perhaps play down a bit because they don't want to make it look like they're covering for American policy. But that's exactly what they are doing. There was a film in the mid-90s where this was put in writing really clearly. I mean, it's all part of all because they sign you into a contract. They sign the producers into a contract. And part of that is to say, don't go against the interests of the US government. There's a similar arrangement from what we can see with new information coming out in the UK,
right?
Where the UK says, do not contradict the interests of the Ministry of Defence and these kind of things. We're just working on that documentation now. But so there was a case in the mid-90s, a film called Countermeasures, which was due to star Sigourney Weaver, and that film was about corruption on an aircraft carrier, and they needed it had been greenlit, it had been written and everything, and it was but the Department of Defense got back to them in writing and said, we're not going to give you this. We have no reason to denigrate the White House or remind the public of the Iran-Contra affair. from the 1980s, which is all gun running and all this thing that was involving the CIA. So they're really clear and explicit. They know exactly what they're doing, and it's the same as what any PR agency would be doing. If you or I were running a PR agency, would probably be as religious and thorough.
Is it flattering to me? Yeah.
Yeah, or is it flattering to our client? Which is, and in a way, you can kind of understand it. If you're selling shampoo or whatever on TV, then you're going to be ruthlessly supportive of the soap industry and not say anything about where that comes from and how bad that is for the environment and all those things. But the big difference here is that, and the reason it's so politically important, is that, you're talking about the most murderous and powerful, unstable organization on the earth, which is the US national security apparatus.
Yeah.
The potential for the danger created by these people is huge. You can imagine, I'm sure a lot of the people who work for it are sort of thinking, well, we're just a cog in a machine. All we're doing is putting a good spin on things here. But it's not really, at an institutional level, it's an absolute nightmare.
So if there was a film then that was politically orientated in a kind of critical or satirical way, say something like Team America, perhaps, as a good example, that didn't require any favors from the government or the security services, it didn't need any, tech or insight or anything like that, and they just wanted to make a film, would there be any influence there? Because if there was no contact between the production team and the security services, but it came on their radar that this might be a little bit subversive, what would happen then?
Usually nothing would happen then. You're sort of getting more into the kind of conspiracy realm if they would reach out. And that's partly because, or largely because, the Hollywood system as it stands anyway already has disincentives to actually produce sort of radical material that really promotes the idea of, kind of a peace economy and that kind of thing. So take, for instance, the Oliver Stone movie called Snowden from 2016.
Yeah.
About Edward Snowden, who I think it's worth reminding people these days because the story's 10 years old. Edward Snowden was responsible for the biggest leak at that time ever, which revealed that the United States had been illegally surveilling people through a variety of online systems and had unprecedented, unparalleled access to people's private data. Edward Snowden ended up having to go and live in Moscow and is still wanted by the US government. Most people consider him to be a hero. Oliver Stone made a movie about his life, and it was a really very well done film, very sympathetic to Edward Snowden, but economically, as with almost all of Oliver Stone's films, he had to get all of the money from Europe.
Right.
Couldn't get any studio behind it. And because of that, and bear in mind, Oliver Stone is one of the most successful filmmakers of all time. He's a millionaire. He's a celebrated figure, artistically and commercially. But he only had 30 days to film the whole movie. And during that time, and I don't mean this to sound insensitive to him or to anyone else, I'm saying it as an illustration. During that time, his mum died. And he had to decide whether to fly back to the US to the funeral or to continue filming. But for financial reasons, they had to continue filming. Now, that's the kind of pressures that are on Hollywood filmmakers if they are basically already, I wouldn't like to say that Oliver Stone's marginalized, but politically there are additional pressures on people like that. So, is it the case that the government will involve itself in a film that it doesn't have any formal levers over? Well, I mean, it is the case that there are concerted campaigns against movies sometimes. And again, Oliver Stone would be a good example. There were thousands of articles written about Oliver Stone's JFK, for instance, the assassination, because he was promoting the assassination conspiracy. And so there's a gigantic backlash from members of the government and from the media as a kind of coordinated response to that sort of reading of history. But the actual Department of Defense office, the formal office, the PR office, the entertainment liaison people, they can't really do anything about a movie that they haven't been contracted into. Another good example of that would be the film about Dick Cheney, which I always was one of the sort of few that I I like to recommend, just because I sort of think that it's, do you know which one I'm referring to?
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, from 2018, I think it is, called Vice.
That's it. Yeah.
I really like Vice, about the Vice President, Dick Cheney. I mean, I think that's one of the, a really quite unusually combative and critical film. And yeah, they didn't ask for any help from the government. They didn't need it, and they did a really good job, I think, of criticizing that upper echelon of defense contractors and politicians. So yeah, there are things that can get through the system, and I think that's perhaps partly, we shouldn't be sort of hopeless about these things. Like, this isn't just a great government conspiracy that can control everything. The levers of government control are absolutely remarkable and were completely unknown until our group got involved with this research over the past couple of decades. But there are still opportunities for some pushback. As I sometimes say, you can have an entire wall. For the listeners, I'm pointing to a library of DVDs. You could make a really
very impressive collection behind him. He's pointing to, yeah.
You could make a lovely wall of DVDs which are critical of the government, which promote alternative histories, and that wall would be great. It's just that on the other wall, if you had to have the blockbuster movies and the pro-militaristic movies and the pro-CIA movies and the movies that all show American benevolence, that wall would be about 10 times bigger and 10 times better funded.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I was thinking then, as you were speaking, it popped into my mind that this sounds eerily similar to the Chomsky's propaganda model. And I do recall reading when I was researching your work that some of your analysis of this issue is based upon Chomsky's propaganda model, wherein there are so many limitations that are fixed and in place, like a structure that you have to operate within, whether it's going to be financial constraints, as in the case of Oliver Stone that you mentioned, where you've got to try and make the movie without a budget, or there's going to be logistical constraints, or it's going to be the commercial constraints, or the fear of political backlash. And by the time your product has filtered its way through all of these different levels, the outcome is likely to be fairly homogeneous, regardless of the intention that initially went into it. And the end results will all be fairly homogeneous without the need for any direct conspiracy theory style influence from the government, just because of these various structural pressures that are fixed in place. Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
That's 100% accurate. I think you've explained the Chomsky propaganda model really beautifully. And that's where all of my theoretical work has come from. In fact, at the beginning of my academic career as a PhD researcher, I was literally applying Chomsky's model to cinema. That's really what I did. And I got to I did a few years of publishing articles about the propaganda model after that. And then I was sort of just going to give up everything to do with academia. And it was only at that point, because I'd said everything, like you say, we know why this material is homogenized. We know why there is this underlying meta-narrative of benevolence. America is the good country. Imperialism isn't even really questioned at any point in the vast majority of these films. And so I got to that point and I thought, well, I'm done with this really. And then it was then it was me and Tom Secker, another researcher, who got together, and that's when we started to put in the Freedom of Information Act requests. Right. And then suddenly there was this deluge of action, which really changed, which made my kind of research career quite different, because it meant that I was actually looking at archival material rather than reading films as texts and considering and looking at there was much more of an emphasis on this actual new data. And we were really shocked to find the extent to which there was government involvement.
Man, can you remind the listeners again then of the sheer scale of this? Because I think you mentioned some figures at the start, which I've completely forgotten, because obviously there's so much to unpack here. Can you give the listeners and myself a reminder of just what we're talking about in terms of the amount of times that this is happening within movies?
Let me put it like this, in terms of what we knew as society. At the turn of the 20th century, the only literature that was out there about this indicated that there were maybe a few hundred, perhaps 300 films that had been in some way affected by, even just affected or had contact with the Department of Defense. No one had even looked at the CIA role at all. There was nothing written about there was nothing to quantify the role of the FBI, for example, or the police forces, NYPD, LAPD. And nothing in any other country like the United Kingdom. So there was maybe just a few hundred films that looked like they had been affected in some way. Nothing written about TV. And then what we've found out this century, over the past couple of decades, is that at least 10,000 products, that's television episodes and movies, have been affected by the national security state. So that's not just the Department of Defense, although the vast majority of them are, a huge chunk of them are Department of Defense, about 3/4. But then also the CIA, which has been involved in around, say, 100. The NYPD and LAPD, which accounts for a couple of thousand or so episodes of things. And the FBI sort of playing a marginal but nonetheless quite important role at different points historically. And of course, that government involvement has become more significant and serious over the past couple of decades as well, in particular because around about 2004, 2005, they started working on not just on movies, because they used to work pretty much just on cinema. But then they started to work on network television and all sorts of things. So, quiz shows, cookery shows, all sorts of things, anything that might involve a member of the military. So, for example, if there's a cheesy TV show that involves like a bomb dog reuniting with his old owner from Iraq, or reuniting couples where one of them has been served overseas and they come back together, all that romantic sort of feel good stuff. Right. There was a TV show that was I can't remember what it was called now, something like Good Chef or something like that involved making dinner for different famous people, and they made dinner for the head of the CIA, and so all those things are kind of they're cool. And then actually, interestingly, in that one, the CIA head chief had to skip dessert because he had to take an extremely important call. All those kind of things. They're all ways of making associating those government organizations with friendly things, with benevolence, with cake, with hard work,
good wholesome dudes working hard to do the right thing, for the people. And of course, sometimes that might be the case, but it's part of a PR system. Got you. And I guess we've known that there's a PR system that operates systematically for just over 100 years. That's what the PR industry arose with that idea that Chomsky talks about, the idea that we need to manufacture consent. We need to provide necessary illusions to control the bewildered herd. Because if not, we'll have democracy running rampant and people will be flying around like headless chickens. We are the ones who need to control what they are thinking and doing, because we are the responsible class of men, is the way that they used to put it. So it is, of course, that's fairly, we all kind of know that PR exists, and we know that advertising is perhaps not such a good thing. But what's been really criminally under-investigated is the role of government, of the state and of the military apparatus in PR. It's still, that information is still covered at various points, but people don't really understand it as well as they understand, cigarette advertising and the dangers of that. People generally aren't as aware of the kind of prevalence and insidiousness of that kind of military and national promotion, right, as they are of, annoying adverts for, I don't know, Wish or whatever it is. Which they get all the time. Well, now you've made that comparison, it kind of does seem obvious, really, when you think of it in that context. It kind of seems like, well, yeah, okay, I can imagine that would totally happen, because they've got an interest to preserve, and propaganda is a very powerful tool, So, now you've kind of clarified it. I can kind of, it kind of seems almost kind of obvious now, almost, but obviously it's hidden in plain sight. It's one of those more insidious forms of propaganda where you're not living under a direct dictatorship where information is, all information is controlled. It's kind of, it's filtered through that propaganda model, and then we all get, a kind of watered down narrative, if not the exact one that they want, And are we talking about like actual editing of scripts? Are we talking about like, do they have someone who will like suggest something and say, oh, how about, you fucking do this instead? And can you end with a shot with the American flag? That'll be cool. Does it at that level?
I think perhaps just for a stylistic reason, they perhaps wouldn't be as clunky as saying, hey, look, we really want an American flag in right here. I mean, like I said, when they said, we have no reason to denigrate the White House or remind the public of the Iran-Contra affair, that was really on the nose. But that was from the mid-1990s. And I suspect that the personnel involved would not hit the nail on the head quite as much as that, because they know that their own emails are the potential for them coming out is there. So they've tended to be a little bit more circumspect with their language. But yeah, it is the case that they ask for line by line rewrites. So for example, take the film The Hulk, for example.
Okay.
So literally there was, I always get this one, the words mixed up on this one, but there was an operation in the script for The Hulk called Operation Ranch Hand, I think it was called. They said, we've got to go and capture the Hulk, and we're going to call it Operation Ranch Hand. And the military said, you can't call it Operation Ranch Hand because that was the name of a chemical weapons program that we used to defoliate Vietnam.
What?
So they bombed Vietnam in an operation and to destroy trees. With Operation Ranch Hand, and by coincidence, the filmmakers had used the same name. And they said, "No, don't use that. You can't use that." So they had to change it to Operation Angry Man. I think they changed it to.
Oh, God.
But the Hulk example is a good one because that was a case where they emailed the filmmakers to say, "Look, we have made," and again they were careful not to say the word sorry. But they basically, in a very apologetic tone, said, look, there are so many changes that we're requiring on this that we are apologetic about that. But either you do it or, this doesn't go ahead. Because a lot of the time it's about, or at least a substantial amount of the time, they just want to disassociate themselves with anything scandalous. So the Hulk movie is about, something going wrong at a military lab. So they're like, just take out anything to do it, get everyone out of uniform. We don't want anything associated with us with that.
Right.
So sometimes it's about sometimes it's about watering things down.
Right.
And sometimes it's about or take the Independence Day movie, for example. In the original Independence Day movie, remember the scenes where they blow up the White House and everything? Yeah. In the original script, they blow up the Pentagon as well. And the Pentagon's like, no, you can't do that because we can protect. We protect the United.
We need to be seen to protect.
We don't ever want to show that.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of things that they take out of movies to water them down. So there's a lot of watering down. Are there also injections of? Is the Pentagon also advising on injecting new material? Yeah, they do that as well. The CIA is perhaps the CIA is slightly different because the CIA doesn't have as many tools to offer the filmmakers. They don't have Black Hawk helicopters and all that kind of thing.
Right.
So what the CIA do is they get in really early with the script writing process. So they often collaborate with the writers even before the film is even known in the public domain.
Wow.
So that, in a way, the CIA is almost kind of more insidious than the Department of Defense, and they're more kind of they do operate in a more conspiratorial way. And also the CIA has got this reputation, of course, for never writing anything down. Of course they do, but they're very circumspect about writing things down. So the script changes for identifying what the CIA has done has been much, much harder to identify. But we know that they work on things like the Tom Hanks movie, Charlie Wilson's War, which was about US foreign policy in Afghanistan, and particularly the arming of the Osama bin Laden terrorist network. And we know, for instance, that they worked on the Recruit, Al Pacino movie, which was about recruitment into the Central Intelligence Agency. And that's a really interesting one because the information for that, no one even knew that the CIA worked on that, and there's no credits or anything like that. But that came out because there was a separate court case, which was nothing to do with politicization. It was a commercial clash. And it came out from the court case and then leaked somehow, which I won't go into, and I can't remember exactly the details, but it was leaked, not to the media. And it was therefore discovered that the CIA had basically written the first draft and was essentially controlling the entire direction ideologically of that movie. But the same sort of things have been happening in things like The Recruit and or even something like Meet the Parents, which is quite. Here's an interesting case of like tiny thing that changes the direction about the ideological direction and the whole vibe of a film. Meet the Parents, comedy, starring Ben Stiller and Robert De Niro. So here's a tiny change that makes a big difference. So if you remember, Ben Stiller walks into Robert De Niro, his father-in-law's office, and he's scared of his father-in-law or potential father-in-law because he wants to marry his daughter, and his father-in-law is scary. And at that point, he finds out that his father-in-law was in the CIA. But the way that he finds out in the original script is he looks around his office and he sees that the whole office is plastered with torture manuals written by the CIA, which is real. From the 1980s, from the School of Americas, which trained the torturers in Central America. And so all of that documentation would have been real. The CIA find out about this and speak to the producers and say, please don't do that. Why don't you replace the torture manuals with with pictures of Robert De Niro hanging out with world leaders? And the producers say, yeah, of course, yeah, that's amazing, perfect idea. But a tiny change like that has a huge impact because, of course, there's been this whole kind of historical amnesia about what happened in the 1980s anyway, with the CIA sponsoring death squads in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and elsewhere. So to have had that in a massive blockbusting popular comedy, I think would have been a real threat in terms of image to the CIA. And you can see how a tiny change like that can have a real big impact. Yeah. And there are often tiny little changes that are made. Something like a film like Iron Man, where originally that character was represented as a genuine anti-war figure. He didn't like his father, who was an arms seller, and the whole idea of that original concept was that he was fighting against the military-industrial complex. But really, by the time they actually make the movie, really what the Robert Downey Jr. character is doing there is channeling the military-industrial complex to kill terrorists, to kill the right bad guys.
Yeah, protecting it, yeah.
There's a chapter in Tricia Jenkins and Tom Seckard's book, Superheroes Movies in the State, from a couple of years ago, which really outlined exactly how that happened. But even then, there were still changes that the Department of Defense required. Robert Downey Jr.'s character says at one point, he makes a joke about, he says something like, I'd die to be in the military or something like that. I can't remember the exact line. But anyway, they had apparently on set, which is very unusual, but they had a stand-up row on set because the Department of Defense said that alludes to high rates of suicide in the military, and we don't want that. So even just sort of a kind of casual, maybe not even meant to be about that, they wanted to get rid of. And they were successful in doing that. I think they ended up saying, I'd give my eye teeth for this or whatever. I can't remember exactly what it was, but extensive changes are made on a constant basis. And there are, you asked about other ways in which ideas are actually inserted. This does happen. So say there was actually a separate military program in the late 1990s as well, which we don't deal with actually directly in the documentary Theatres of War, because it was a separate thing. It was a separate pot of money under the Clinton administration, about $40 million, I think they had. And it was to promote the war on drugs. But it was run by a separate military entity, not the usual office that we're talking about. It was run by a separate military entity. And they, remember all those kind of crappy daytime TV shows like Beverly Hills 90210 and Chicago Hope and all that sort of thing, that they were secretly pushing and ensuring that there were ideas in there that were opposing the idea of drugs. Now, in a way, I can kind of see that as a public safety thing. I do understand, but A, it was done secretly, and B, it was really over the top and kind of ridiculous. Like there was an episode of Chicago Hope where I think someone like has a toke of a joint and then gets themselves involved in a massive car accident and like and then has to have a blood transfusion, and I think the doctor at one point says, if you don't give up drugs, you're not getting a drug transfusion. It's a funny episode. I watched it a couple of years ago. It's worth watching. It's almost as mad as that, or twice as mad as that. I can't remember, but it's funny. So and eventually the media, the alternative media, Salon.com, found out about this, and that put pressure on it, and they had to get rid of that program. But yeah, so, yeah, it just happens all the time. A lot of the Marvel series is affected in this way. You ask about the do they ever wave the flag? I mean, I always think that the worst series, the most disappointing series of all time, has been the Terminator series, because I love Terminator 1 and 2, one of the best films ever. No military involvement in them, and really subversive films and against institutional authority. And even Terminator 3, which I know everyone hates, but I think is fantastic. Terminator 3 only had courtesy support. I think I don't think they actually contracted them into anything. I think they may have provided some extras or something like that. So that was still a reasonable film. But by the fourth film, it was absolutely insane. You literally do have the final scene of that is the military flying off into the sunset. This is full cooperation from the Department of Defense, flying off into the sunset, saying something along the lines of, we will defend democracy wherever it is. It's like, right. What are you even talking about? Like, you're in a post-nuclear world. You're completely screwed. They completely betray the backstory of and the whole world that they're actually in. Someone has open heart surgery in a nuclear apocalypse at the end of Terminator 4. It's just an absolute mess. But they literally do. It's as close as you get to the actual flag flying. Is that final flying off into the sunset? I mean, it reminds me of another film, which is more an older example from 1968. But it's almost like the classic example of like the kind of, this is the extent to which they can do it. John Wayne, the cowboy actor, wrote to President Johnson at the height of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War and said, I want to make a propaganda film about the Vietnam War that will show how good we are. President Johnson replied saying, yes, whatever you want, whatever you need. They made the film. The film ends with John Wayne and a little Vietnamese kid walking off into the sunset, with John Wayne saying, "Hey, kid, this is what this war is all about," and walking off into the sunset. And then the credits roll, and there's also an exchange between the Department of Defense and John Wayne, all coordinated by the president, the most famous actor at the time, and the president of the United States at the time. And they say, shall we say thank you to the Department of Defense? They say, no, let's not do that, because it may, because the public will be aware then that this has been a propaganda film. Yeah. But that kind of thing does happen all the time. That's just the most on the nose and well documented example.
That's fascinating. Makes a lot of sense now, man. Yeah, you've really cleared it up. I mean, I was gonna say, would it be a telltale sign then, if we're watching a movie and there's lots of helicopters and military paraphernalia in there, that it's highly likely that there's gonna be some editorial involvement from the military? But it seems from the examples you've just given, where it's like Iron Man and all sorts of shit, that this is far more insidious than that. Well, Meet the Parents would be a better example than Iron Man, because like just that example of having the those books on the bookshelf would have been funnier to show that this guy has a background in torture tactics.
It would have been a better. Yeah,
and the comedic value would have been better, but it's far more insidious than just helicopters and runways and stuff. So this runs deep, like.
There is a secondary concern here. I mean, my primary concern is this is a propaganda issue, and it is a threat to the population of the world, because it is part of a system, an important and underrated part of a system to promote American imposed violence and domination. Yeah. It's really bad for that reason. But there is a secondary, much less important, but nonetheless still annoying reason why I oppose this, and that's for a creative reason. These organizations are wrecking movies. They are making movies really banal. They're making movies and TV shows really boring, uninteresting. It's a chilling effect. on all of these products. But like you say, in that particular instance, is making things a lot less funny. It's also giving the impression, actually, that the United States and the American people are violent, bloodthirsty, pro-military, and they're not necessarily. This is something that is imposed largely from above. There's an interesting example with the way that they do flyovers in sports. This is an area that's more by Tricia Jenkins, a colleague of mine, and she points out that when the players come out I'm not very good on American sports, but I think it's baseball, and I think it's probably all of them. When the players come out onto the field, obviously everyone wants to stand and applaud, and at that very moment, the military will often do a flyover of their jets, so it looks like the whole audience of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are rising to applaud the military. They're applauding the players.
Got you.
To at least, and again, I don't know the exact extent to this. I've never been to an American ball game or whatever, but at least to a large extent, they are applauding the players, but they are obliged to, and they have the spectacle of applauding the US military. A lot of those people might well not want to do that, but what are they going to do? Say, I'm going to go and watch my favorite team, and then I'm going to deliberately sit down. I don't look like I might be part of a thing that's applauding the U.S. Air Force.
Motherfuckers.
And there are other films as well, which are where everyone involved admits that they just couldn't have done it without the military. Top Gun 2 being an example from about 18 months ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole film. One of the reasons that the film that there was 30 years between that and between the first film and a sequel is because in the early 90s there'd been a very widely reported sex scandal involving the US Navy, and so apparently they said, "Oh, should we make a sequel?" And they went, "No, because we kind of caused the conditions for this. There was a Top Gun effect which created this sexism in the ranks." Remember there's a scene of the original Top Gun where Tom Cruise sort of bursts through into a woman's toilet and is like, "Hey," sort of making it. Right. And that's the sort of thing that was happening at the that happened in the real world and changed the culture and machoified, if that's the right word, the whole culture. There's one of the reasons that they didn't make a sequel to that movie until 30 years later. But then, of course, they say, there's no way we could have made this. It's all initiated by both parties.
Symbiotic, yeah.
It's symbiotic, completely symbiotic, and something like Black Hawk Down is the kind of the classic case where Ridley Scott, the director, said, I could have made this without the Department of Defense, but I'd have had to have called it Huey Down, and referring to the crappy little helicopters,
Yeah. Those films would be impossible to make, wouldn't they, without the military on side? You just couldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, whenever you see a helicopter or planes and things like that, 9 times out of 10, it will be military. Sometimes they can do stuff with CGI, but this is a question that repeatedly comes up. Can they? Is the military's role actually on the decline because of CGI? I mean, they've been talking about this for 20 years since I've been involved in this, and they've never really done it. I mean, I think I watched King Kong recently, and I seem to remember there being CGI military planes in that, and I just remember thinking, that doesn't even look very good yet. I mean, maybe things will change with AI, but certainly the Department of Defense hasn't been worried about any of this. Actually, filming an aircraft carrier still looks amazing, and they don't seem to be able to replicate that in any way. So this relationship is going to continue.
Wow, this is wild shit, man. Well, given that we're talking about the propaganda model here, and I know that when Chomsky was talking about that in the book Manufacturing Consent, which everybody should go and read, he was primarily talking about, in the examples that I remember, news, information, and how that is, co-opted and controlled through the system. You've applied it brilliantly and effectively to the movie industry. But do you think that it could apply to other industries within the entertainment sphere, such as, let's say, the one that I'm in, the music industry?
I did write an article about music, and the role of the military is obviously much less significant. There's not a great deal they can do, but there are sometimes, there are quite a few examples where where the government in one way or another has got involved. I mean, the classic case being when God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols was going to get to number one, and then it was artificially kept off number one, and there was a big scandal about whether it was, whether they deliberately kept it off by manipulating the sales figures in 1977, I think. But there are various other cases like that. Wasn't there a case a few years ago, when Margaret Thatcher died, and they had Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead was released. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And I think they artificially kept that. I'm trying to remember the details now. It was a while ago since I wrote the piece. And there was also, and of course, the military does sometimes get involved in doing large scale filming on Air Force bases and stuff like that. I'm trying to remember who did it. Was it Beyonce? But there are various big stars that have done very heavily militarized video shoots involving the military, and there certainly is political interference involving the reception of songs. But I think perhaps overall, again, it's because the pop industry is already so
diluted,
controlled and contrived, and also there's only so much you could, even in the very genre of it, it's quite difficult to say a great deal about an international conflict and international domination and illegitimacy in a set of lyrics. I mean, there are plenty of really great rock stars and bands out there who have done political stuff, but to what extent can they sort of provide new information, for example, a new analysis? In what is effectively a poem.
Yes.
I mean, a good example of a rock star who has really pursued the political line of peace and has been very much marginalized, not only by his society but also by his bandmates, would be Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. He re-released that song about Reagan a couple of years ago, which was brilliant.
The Bravery of Being Out of Range, is it?
That's the one. Yeah. So
I love Roger Waters.
Yeah, he's fantastic. And he's been a very vocal supporter of Julian Assange, and and been very roundly criticised by all sorts of different powerful organisations. So I think if you sustain as a rock star, if you sustain your activism, you can certainly it certainly is the route to marginalization. Whether one particular product can be interfered with directly by the military and whether they'd actually care about that is another question.
That's interesting that you say that, because there are different barriers, really, because of the nature of the medium as you described it. I've had a situation myself.
Oh, right, okay.
Where I released an album in the lockdown called Make Anger Great Again. It came out a month before Trump was running for the re-election. Obviously, he was running the hashtag online Make America Great Again. And my one, Make Anger Great Again, was supposed to be a flip of that. It was all about rising up against tyranny and all that sort of stuff. A load of protest songs about rising up and let's have a revolution and all that sort of stuff. And within one day of me posting my first video, which basically had a lot of protest footage in, Google and YouTube took it offline after one day. They said that it contained shocking content. The shocking content when I spoke to them was actually the Colston statue coming down, which is footage I got from within YouTube. Facebook wouldn't let me run any paid ads on the album or the song because they said that it was politically insightful. And I was immediately then shadow banned on all platforms.
You should have said it was politically insightful, actually.
And then like social media, because I didn't have a label. I was doing it independently, and I had a big following on social media. I had about 350,000 followers on Twitter, very engaged audience, influencer level engagement, and then literally within the space of a few weeks, fucking invisible. And I've been pretty much that way ever since. And to have a song taken down, and there's no bad language in there. It's not violent. It doesn't break any of their rules and regulations, but they just took it down and denied me, revoked my advertising rights, demonetized everything, the full works. So although that didn't come from the military or the government, it came from big tech, which is obviously still part of that same machinery. So, same outcome, different player, really. It doesn't have to be the military or the government necessarily. Mine came from big tech, and it's part of that layers of propaganda model that you talked about earlier with the commercial constraints of something, which leads many to self-censor so they don't suffer the same fate as me and have their career trolleyed, you know?
I think that having that focus, that broader focus about what society does, politicized elements of society do, is actually really important. It's an area where, like I say, over the last few years, we've been so focused on this archive of material coming out from formal offices, the military offices and the Central Intelligence Agency offices and so on. But the broader cultural problem, and also the problem with these social media giants, is also a massive issue. And I'm, almost like the role of the military can sometimes feel slightly quaint, right? Because actually the real control that is utilized is by these social media giants in exactly the way that you're talking about, and in a way that is really unaccountable. And does anyone have any documentation about shadow banning, for example? I mean, we can see the audience figures seem to go down precipitously and artificially when someone releases something political.
100%.
I saw Owen Jones from The Guardian show his figures online after he released particular information about Gaza, just dropping off 2 or 3 weeks ago.
I've had the same.
And this is not just something that's affecting a few journalists. Like you say, it does seem to be something that's affecting artists as well. Even just alluding to a particular political issue, using the same language as MAGA in an ironic way. It's absolutely insane. It's a really disturbing new twist on what's happening, and I think it's really incumbent upon people like me who are researching that kind of thing to not put all the emphasis on the military and the CIA. And I think Chomsky would very much agree with that, because we're talking about whole systems. We're not just talking about a kind of conspiracy, a cabal of people who are working in a couple of cities.
It's a structure.
It's a structure. So that's why I guess that's one of the reasons why, on a personal level, although I do still work on this, it's mainly being driven by Professor Stahl from Georgia University, and I tend to do things that are a bit more about the wider world, and that's what my YouTube series is at the moment. It is about the way that the media represents things, and it is about censorship and about propaganda, but it's also trying to consider the major issues of the world holistically. And the major issues of the world are Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and China, Taiwan. And really not those countries. It's the US and UK's role in completely fucking them up.
Yes, 100%. Beautifully put as well. And I'm glad you mentioned the UK there, the little lapdog. I'm sure that we have our own version of this. I'm fucking definite we have our own version of this. What is it like in the UK? Is it very much following the same model in terms of the movie industry?
I'm working with a PhD student at the moment about this. So it'll be a few years before we get really clear answers. But again, it is similar, and we are surprised to see it similar. We've only been working on this for a couple of years. And when I first started speaking to the PhD student, Tarek, I was a bit like, well, you might not find that much here. You might, you want to do something like what we did with the DoD stuff in the US. And don't get disappointed, but actually very quickly he found about 300 examples of films and TV shows that have been impacted in some way by the Ministry of Defence and by civil service involvement. And again, it looks like that's accelerated throughout the 21st century. There are really famous examples. Obviously, the James Bond films have all been messed around with in one way or another, but they're already so supportive of UK foreign policy. But there are a few changes that we've been able to identify over the years. But also a film like Kingsman, that series, I don't know if you saw that. It's basically a recruitment advert, and with some changes in it that are made, which are quite sort of pointed in terms of international implications. So again, we haven't actually got the script changes for this. Again, perhaps partly because the British system is perhaps a little bit more secret even than the US, and less accountable. And this process has not been has been even less well documented. So, for instance, but in Kingsman, I think it's Kingsman 3. Like the major villain in that is the Rasputin figure from Russia, and he's villainized because he's taken Russia out of the First World War. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Ideologically, the bad guy from the movie is the one that's stopped engaging in what is universally acknowledged to be the worst war. So some interesting stuff going on ideologically, I think, in that movie. And but yeah, the system is similar, a bit more ad hoc from what we can see, a bit less formalized, more individual offices around, but secrecy is all around. I mean, there was an interesting case of a biopic. But this is a really historical example, but it's kind of really on the nose. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister from about 100 years ago, he had a biopic made about him right at the sort of beginning of cinema, and they made the biopic, and he watched it and he was like, "Yuck, I don't like that." He got the one copy of the film, he put it in a safe, and then no one found it until about, I don't know, 1999 or something.
Wow.
Like 50 years after he died, they're like, "Oh look, we never released this movie because the Prime Minister of England just decided, the Prime Minister of Britain just decided to suppress it and not tell anyone about it." So there are, that's a very kind of cartoonish example, but yeah, the British cases are similar, and of course all the other countries have been catching up as well, and in terms of involvement with entertainment as well. China's come up with a couple of really terrible sort of nationalistic schlock that reminds you of the 1980s American movies.
India, all I watch is Bollywood. That's all I watch.
Oh, really?
I've seen fucking thousands of those films, man. I just watched one last night, and I could see it in that.
Is there anything political in I don't really know Bollywood, but is there anything political or military in those?
100%. 100%. Some of it is so sicky. It's like, oh, come on, dude. You got the one lone bloodied soldier hero climbing his way to the top of the cliff to save the little girl, and then when he gets to the top, his first priority is to kiss the flag and put it down, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just so that every bad guy is from Pakistan. There's all that stuff.
Wow. That's really interesting. I should check out a bit more about Bollywood. But this is not just an American problem. We're not just sort of shitting on the Americans. It is a universal problem of nationalism and those kind of systems. I mean, America is particularly interesting. Partly, I've just researched America for a longer period of time than these other things, than these other places. But I guess America is important because of its role throughout the world, as a political issue. But actually, someone should do an analysis of Bollywood, because obviously there is the potential for India and Pakistan to destroy the world. Even though you'd think that there'll be a regional conflict, actually, if that conflict ever does go nuclear, that's the end of all of us. And we won't have even known that it's happening.
I'm amazed how much they goad them in those films. Like the bad guys are always Pakistan. They're always at war with Pakistan, and they're always shady, and like the Indians are always so holier than thou, and they don't want to fight, But it's quite overt.
That's really, really interesting. Absolutely fascinating. I should check out a few of those Bollywood movies. I wonder if Pakistan does something similar as well.
I've wondered that. Yeah, I've wondered that. But the role of the influence of Indian cinema throughout Asia is massive. I mean, those guys are fucking megastars. And their films are massive in China and throughout the Middle East and everything, and throughout Asia as well, and increasingly in Europe now as well. So I think it does have quite a powerful role in the propaganda machine.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. I'm glad that you've contextualized it like that. This is a really good discussion, because I think all these kind of ways of broadening our understanding are really important for diagnosing what the problem is here. And it's not just the problem of a few weirdy generals in the United States with their claws in everything. I mean, that's happening as well, but it's a broader socio-cultural and political issue that's affecting the whole international system. And we need to be alert to preventing and resisting propaganda wherever it is. To create a more stable world through open systems of communication. I hope that didn't sound too preachy, but I'm trying to bring it together as an overall thing.
Yeah, no, nailed it, man. No, brilliantly put. It's quite clear, I think, from the way that the conversation is evolving now, that there are many different elements to this propaganda model. And what started out in my mind as, a vision of like 8 guys sitting in a dark, low-lit room chomping cigars and conspiring against Hollywood directors is actually a bit more nuanced and layered than that. This filtration system kind of includes, commercial pressure, financial pressure, logistical, relationship pressure, wanting to keep people sweet, in case you need them next time, all that sort of stuff. So it's very subtle and sinister and all pervasive by the seams of it, which is a lot scarier and a lot more difficult to spot and to do something about than the more simplified version of the conspiracy theory, you know. So I think given that we've covered so much ground here in this conversation, I think this would be a perfect launch point now for people to do a deeper dive into your books and documentaries and all of the great research and work that you've done on this over the years. So for anyone that wants to do a deeper dive into the detail and the data of what you've been working on this, where can they go? What have you got coming up? What have you got going on? And, you know, what do you want to tell the people?
Well, I'm not really selling anything at the moment, James, but I am...
Sell it!
But I am... but people can go to a couple of free things that I'm doing. One which is Matthew Alford, or Dr. Matthew Alford on Substack, and my YouTube channel is Dr. Matthew Alford on YouTube. And this year I'm doing Worst Year Ever, which is the worst year ever in international relations, which is detailed analysis, detailed, heavy-hearted laughs about the prospects for a third world war this year. So a lot of analysis of Israel, of Iran, of Ukraine. I've got a new piece coming out about Noam Chomsky next week.
Wow.
A sort of tribute to his work. And so yeah, Substack and YouTube, check out my work there. The two movies that I've been heavily involved in are The Writer with No Hands, which is also available as a book, and Theatres of War, which is available on Vimeo. I think is currently available for free for a couple of weeks due to a promotional thing that was being put last night. But Theatres of War is the one that relates most closely to what we've been discussing today.
Awesome. Right, well, I'll put links into the show notes so people can click straight through and check out all of your amazing work. Matt, thank you so much for this conversation today, man. It's been truly fascinating. This is right up my street, all this stuff, and I can't wait to do a deeper dive into your amazing work as well. So thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, man. Best wishes with everything moving forward, and I can't wait to see what you do next. So thanks for being with us, bro. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks very much, James. It was a pleasure to be on, and have a good day.
Dr. Matthew Alford, ladies and gentlemen. What a dude. You know, I think this is one of those episodes where I think it would really benefit to jump on YouTube and listen to it on YouTube, where you can get involved in the comments, because I'd love to know what you guys think of this. If you've got any examples from movies that you've seen where you can definitely see some kind of like militaristic or nationalistic bias within the narrative, I'd love to know if you've got any more information. So let's have a conversation. Head over to YouTube, wherever you listen to this from. Jump on the YouTube at James Kennedy Podcast and jump in the comments and let us know what you guys think. Because, I think it's fascinating stuff, how the subtle ways the propaganda weaves its way through all of our culture. I think it's far scarier that way than, you know, living in like North Korea or something where it's just so blatant and overt. Because at least then you know it's propaganda. And the end results are still the same, regardless of the method, but it's done under the guise of freedom. You know, we think that we're a free and open society when actually, as Matt has demonstrated through this conversation, our art and social commentary and satire and just plain fucking entertainment are watered down and chiseled down at so many different levels, through so many different stages, that the end result doesn't resemble anything like the original intention. And the end result will always be nice and cozily conformist with the preferred boundaries of discourse of our government. And I think that's something that we need to know about. So hats off to Matt and his colleagues for highlighting all of this stuff. They've been working on this stuff for years, and it's all backed up and proven with documentation. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. So if you want to continue to follow Matt's work, as he said, he'd like you to check out his Substack, which is drmattalford.substack.com, or head to his YouTube channel where he's got some brilliant content on there at Dr. Matthew Alford on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes, so you can just click and go straight there. And he's also got a bunch of books which look really awesome, so I think I'm going to have to go out and buy all of these bad boys. They include National Security Cinema, The Writer with No Hands, and Real Power. That's R-E-E-L, as in tape reel, get it? So go and feast your brain upon those as well. I hope you enjoyed that conversation and found it as interesting as I did. If you did, give us a like, give us a star rating, give us a thumbs up, give us a follow and a subscribe or a hell yeah, or whatever the hell you got to do. Show us some love and we'll keep it coming. Don't forget to head to YouTube and check out the on the streets footage that I've been putting up from outside the Royal Courts 2 weeks ago with people like Richard Medhurst, Jeremy Corbyn, Andrew Feinstein, and all the others that I mentioned. And I shall be back next week with another awesome conversation with another brilliant guest. So stay tuned, stay informed, stay awake, and stay on the right side of the fight. Love you loads.